I am in Pacific time, so it's not quite noon yet, and you could possibly help me with this question I have about so-called glimpses
Yeah.
and the relevance and the
Mm,
reality of them or not. Um,
mm,
without going too much into story, I feel that I've had a few of them where the me will fall away for a moment, and then as soon as I realize it's back, and I know there's nothing I could do to make it happen or influence it, but
mm.
I want to believe that it's leading me somewhere and that eventually it'll just stop coming back. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Mm. Yeah, that's a nice, juicy idea that the person likes, right? That I'm going to
yeah,
arrive and at a final destination. That's very
yeah.
juicy. It's always being told that. Do you remember as a kid when you didn't have those sorts of ideas?
Yeah, when you were just doing what was happening.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I used to love to play endlessly for hours, and just no sense of time or what I was doing or where I was going. What do you imagine that to be like to finally arrive?
Um, I I think about that quote about like to get into the kingdom of heaven, you must come as children or something like that.
Mm,
Um, and so I do feel like that sort of not state, but happening would need to be present again, where you're just sort of unselfconsciously in what's happening, like a kid.
mm, mm, mm. And are you prepared? Is there a preparedness to give up all stories? Is there stories that you still want to hold on to? Like, you sound like you've got a younger voice. I might be wrong, but you sound like you're on the younger side of life.
I'm
You,
29.
you're 29, yeah. So, how does it? What about you know, is there is there still things that are very important to you?
I think that the story about like my trauma and the trying to overcome it, and I have still some resentments about my trauma, and like I still have hope about feeling better. That
Mm,
story is still really alive for me.
mm. Like being rescued, like
Yeah,
out of the
rescuing
trauma.
yourself,
Mm,
finding psychological help. Yeah.
mm, mm. Don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of psychology and I think it can be really helpful, if you've had a traumatic childhood and difficult conditioning, it can really help and it can help you to not totally destroy and destruct your life. But it's not the answer. It will endlessly go on.
Right.
So, what is left? So, if you're
It seems,
not, mm,
sorry, go ahead.
if you're not fixing yourself, if you're not fixing the habits and the conditioning of you, then what do you have left?
Kind of seems like that's all that there is the constant drive to fix or change.
Mm, mm. Now, who would you be without that? Like, what would you do?
Sometimes there's a fear about and a feeling of sad loss that
Yeah.
there's not a person who's doing it and it's like a big trick. But when I think about it logically, I'm like, well, then you would just be what was happening and there would be no
Mm,
judgments about it.
yeah. Mm, mm,
Yeah, I mean, I know that I can't choose to let things happen or not let things happen, but I'm just trying to be as hands off as I can be. But there are times when I get like, I guess you could say a spiritual depression where
Mm.
life is hard and I feel like nothing is improving and I don't
Mm.
feel any lightness of being. Instead, everything feels very heavy
Mm.
and
What does
I
your
get
body
caught up.
what
Sorry.
yeah, what does your body feel right now? Or your experience, like what's happening in the experience?
Um, I feel a restlessness, like a searching sort
Mm.
of anxiety.
Where do you feel that restlessness?
Um, Down from my throat into my stomach.
Yeah. So just notice that. And that's totally okay to feel. So the feeling itself was saying, "Get me the fuck out of here," in its most manic place. And that restlessness, in its really extreme way of being, it could be like a drug addict, alcohol, like it could be all types of addicted to all types of things in order to not feel it, addicted to working. So just allow that into the experience. So this pain from the throat to the heart, did you say, or did you say to the chest?
Yeah, down to the stomach.
Stomach. So just let that feeling in. And that feeling is dominating the experience and it's making it feel like you have to do something to get rid of that. And so an idea that comes up often is to look into psychology to try to work it out. And that's valid and you can spend time doing that. But also spending time just allowing that feeling in. I'm not really telling you to put effort into allowing it. It's more like letting that feeling in and noticing that there is something that's experiencing it which isn't affected. At the moment, what happens is the experiencer and that feeling feel like one and the same thing. So you feel like you're this person that's deeply agitated. Not now, but in those moments when it's very strong. So you've got to do something in order to get out of that. And then what happens in waking up is there begins to be a separation from that which is experiencing to the feelings. So you've got this feeling that's uncomfortable and it's appearing in experiencing. It's not who you actually are, it's part of the experience. But that part of experience is desperate to do something to avoid it. So, kind of like what I'm suggesting is kind of a relaxation into that, and then a noticing that there's something experiencing that. And that which is experiencing the restlessness doesn't need anything, doesn't need to be
Yeah.
fixed, it doesn't need forgiveness, it doesn't want to blame, it doesn't need relaxation, it doesn't need another. It's just here. For nothing, with nothing, wanting nothing. It's just here.
Sometimes when things are really hard and I'm like overwhelmed with stress or anxiety, let's say, um, there is that sort of recognition where I feel like the me doesn't have any strength to control, and I feel like my only choice is to just let go and be
Mm.
overwhelmed. And I
Mm.
notice that everything continues to happen, that nothing stops or slows down. And
Mm.
so there's this sense that like the me is not really necessary to drive life forward. It's just
Mm.
happening, 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 and the me is like not really a factor. It's just something that popped up. I don't know why.
Mm. Mm. Nice.
So there's really nothing to do because there's no problem, I guess. If a parent therapy arises, then that's just what happens and it's part of
Mm,
the journey.
totally. Mm. Just the surrendering what that happens, that's what happens. Mm.
And there's an attachment to success in that, but it's also irrelevant if there is success for this individual body or not, because
Mm.
success is not really a thing either. So,
Mm. No, you'll never really get to success. You'll have ideas about success, then it will quench seeking dynamics in you. So, if you get success, then there will be feelings of feeling good enough and feelings of being valid and feelings of fitting in, which is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's not actually what you want. Those are fleeting experiences. So success actually doesn't exist as a thing that's permanent. It's fleeting experiences. What you actually want, the permanence that you want, is that which is experiencing now. That which is now.
right. There's a feeling that in order to so-called be with what is experiencing now, I would be irresponsible to the people in my life. Like I need to put in effort into what I'm doing to help and satisfy the people in my life.
Mm.
Uh, but
That
again,
might that might that might be true on the relative level. There can be expectations. Like I own a dog, or she owns me. I'm not quite sure which way around it is. So there's like responsibility, but that doesn't take from your happiness. That doesn't take from your freedom. That's an action that comes up. So there can be
so
expectations for others, and then there can be seeking. So in that expectation from others, it can activate you into feeling not good enough, feeling incapable, feeling inept, and then that creates seeking. But in itself, expectations is part of life. Like in a way, the plant expects the birds to poop in order to generate manure in order for it to grow, although it doesn't really have a thought that it expects it. But it's like we're dependent on things in this life. The suffering arises when you believe in yourself and you believe in the other and you believe that they or yourself are happiness and freedom. Freedom is your essence. It's pain or pleasure.
so can I say that it's sort of a recognition of being one with the totality of eternal manifestation or something, like
Mm,
where there's no
beautiful.
responsibility of the individual because there
Mm,
is no individual?
totally, but there's apparent responsibility. I have to feed my dog, otherwise she dies.
But does the feeding of the dog happen because you do it, or is it just what arises, like without you choosing it?
There's apparent choice, but there's nobody choosing. Ramesh Balsekar always used to say, if life didn't give us the appearance of apparent choice, that would be the feeling of being caged. So it's such a
Yeah.
beautiful mechanism. And every animal has that. Even though Khaleesi, she doesn't have any sense of what choice is or isn't, if she's presented with a carrot or a chicken, the feeling in her is apparent choice. She sniffs them both, and then there's appearance of choice. But then one is selected, and that is the only one that could be selected. And in a way, you could say she's predestined to select that, because if she's got a chicken and a carrot, I can almost guarantee she's going to pick the chicken and not carrot.
So, right, and that on a human level of all the variety of choices we have and seeing it like that, there is no failure and there's also no good or evil.
Totally. That's wonderful. There's no failure, there's no success, and there's no good, and there's no evil. There is only what's happening. There is good and bad and success and failure in the human minds. So if you go out and murder someone, then you are considered bad in society.
Right.
But ultimately,
But
no, we've made it all up. We murder all the times as humans. It's just dependent on what we think is acceptable murder and what isn't acceptable murder.
right.
Like especially us in the West, our wealth, our freedom is dependent on the non-freedom of poorer countries. We can only afford to have so many resources because poorer countries work for a cheaper rate. And that will incur starvation, poverty, deprivation, death, slavery. So it's all dependent on what we deem as good and bad. But yet if somebody in America set up a company which did a slavery in American soil, that would be considered bad and they would be sent to prison.
Right.
But it's okay to pay somebody $1 a day who's desperate in Bangladesh. I couldn't think of the country's name then, in Bangladesh.
Right.
In fact, some people would
why,
say it's a good thing because we're giving them money, like it's, and some people would say that it's a bad, whatever.
right.
Like, it's all dependent on what our society says is good and what our society says is bad. So there is no ultimate good and bad. There's what our society depicts as good and bad. What's
Yeah.
beneficial or useful for our society. There is only what's happening. And you'll never find freedom in being a good person. You'll have a more pleasurable existence if you are good in terms of society, more than likely, because you'll have less problems. But you will not find freedom in that. In fact, that's a cage to be a good person. It's a cage to be a bad person. Your freedom is always in this moment. Always. It's right here.
Yeah. It's like it's not can sound complicated, but really it's just like a matter of putting down the question and whenever I can just giving up that need to know or to figure out where the line is between good and wrong.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have trauma around good and bad?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, sometimes when you've been traumatized, then you can have a bit of a polarity between good and bad. So if you've had parents that were more unreliable, then you can sometimes have more of a extreme need for the idea of good and bad because you had to for survival. So it's just seeing that, like, that's not true. So
Right.
you need the validation of good in order to feel safe. You need to be good. Your friends need to be good. Or equally bad, it depends on the conditioning. But so it's just seeing that that's a dynamic that appears.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
That's,
But it just doesn't bring freedom. Freedom is what you are right now, that which is experiencing.
it's the best possible message because it just means that all of the stuff I felt like I had to repent for, that I was guilty for, it is an illusion,
Yeah,
and all there's no tally of what we're doing. It's just,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. You're totally not guilty. Your actions have been dependent on everything that came before you. In fact, you don't exist. You are a result of everything that came before you. And if you're unfortunate to have what we would say like difficult conditioning that's done difficult things, then you'll be demonized by an ignorant society. As society becomes more understanding, then it will see that it's simply program and conditioning that doesn't start and doesn't stop. So there isn't a good person or a bad person, there is conditioning and genetics which play out. And if you've got difficult dynamics, then more than likely you will then enact difficult things in life, and you aren't guilty of them. It doesn't mean that you're not held responsible and we don't try and recondition that, but you are not guilty. Nobody is guilty, no matter what they do. Nobody is guilty. Nobody.
Yeah.
And
Well,
nobody is to blame. There is no victim and there is no perpetrator. It doesn't mean that if somebody doesn't have a ravenous desire to murder, that we don't restrain that person. But a more evolved society, but we don't come from a more evolved society, we come from a very ignorant society, would completely understand that that is a product of everything that came before. There isn't an evil person inside anyone. If you have had trauma, you are going to enact trauma. If you have had difficult conditioning, a difficult childhood, then you will enact that. And this is why it's so unfair when it comes to wealth distribution, because a lot of people in economic instability become traumatized and then pass on that trauma to the kids. And then it's a cycle of those families cannot get out of economic poverty because they can't maintain work, maybe they can't maintain relationships, and they don't believe in themselves. So they have all these conditionings that are working against them. And then you've got people that are richer that have less trauma, even though people that are rich can have lots of trauma, but they might have less trauma, particularly around economics. So in some ways there might have been an easier, more stable upbringing. So therefore they're more likely to be able to produce wealth in the next generations. They might not be happy, they might suffer, but they'll be more stable people maybe because they've had less economic trauma. So this is why it's so deeply unfair, our current system. So what happens, say, in England is that refugees come to England and they've already been traumatized by being made a refugee, so this will be passed on to the children. They cannot help it. And then you've got a society that judges that and sees them maybe as bad people if they're struggling to produce and to work. So but if you've got traumatized parents, they're gonna traumatize you. It's just the way it is. And then you've got the judgment of the rest of society. They're bad people. It's so ignorant. It's absolute ignorance. And it's never going to work. It's an identified society that will just maintain and reproduce suffering, terrible suffering. So the more that we understand trauma and psychology, the more that we'll see that people's behavior is dependent on their internal way of seeing the world, which will be genetic and will have been conditioned to them in early life. If you've been conditioned to be a failure, then, and been told that many times, then you will struggle to be successful. Or you could have the opposite and be over successful, but most likely you'll struggle to be successful. And then what our society says is they say, you are guilty for not being successful, you are responsible for your unhappiness. But and this is where law of attraction comes in, because your internal way of viewing the world will affect what you externally produce.
Right.
And the freedom of it is firstly what we have to do as a society, because you can't really change your dynamics until you really see that they're not you. And you can't really forgive other people. So say if other people have done terrible things because of their trauma from childhood, you can't really forgive them until you see that that's not them. Most of the time we see it as them. They are a murderer and they are an evil person. But when you really see it's not them, it's a habit and condition that's acting out, then you really forgive them. And then you'll really forgive yourself.
Yeah.
So there's got to be that, and then we have to address like the ways in which we teach the world is to kids. Like today I went round to a friend's, and I don't know why, but the school decided to teach the kids the American Civil War. And it's in English. Like normally in England we don't learn about American history that much, we do a bit. And I can see there's good things in the learning about the American Civil War. But also, the kid's like 7, why are we teaching them about war? There's so many other things that we could teach them about. Because the education system is so weird. Like, first of all, why not let's teach them about psychology? Let's not get on to war and why we have wars until we're maybe in the teens, when we've talked about what trauma is, we've talked about what difficulty is with emotions. So we've addressed all these types of things, and then move on to war and when they're older, and like slavery and what we've done in the past and our history. But first of all, let's teach them how to deal with their emotions, their feelings, like the way they see themselves, the way they see other. Like I was like, wow, 7 years old and we're already teaching them about war.
Right.
And that's a story that we're teaching. Like that's a narrative of our society that we're teaching.
Yeah. I mean, even down to the language of trying to get over a cold, like you've got to kill the bug.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Mm.
yeah, it's true what you're saying, and I suppose there can be a feeling of stuckness if I believe that I have agency and choice, but seeing that that isn't the case, it's just it is what it is, and it sounds crass considering the suffering that there is, but it's it's also perfect and complete as it
Mm.
occurs,
Mm.
including the fact that climate change is destroying our planet and will be significantly suffering in just a few decades. Even
Mm.
that is also perfect.
Mm. Yeah. Mm.
Which makes no sense to the human, but
No. Yeah. Mm.
because I really want to have a long lifetime, and I want to be able to have children, and the fact that I feel like I can't have kids because of the future of climate change is so painful,
Mm.
but when I let go, it's like, well, that just is what it is, and I could only
Mm.
live till I'm 40 and it's still perfect.
Mm. Yeah. Mm. And
I
ultimately,
don't
you
know.
will never die. You were never born and you will never die. So the person might die at 40, but who you are will never be born and will never die. You'll
Right,
never
because it's
really lose anything. So it's only the the one that doesn't want to die is a functioning that's speaking. It's not actually talking about you.
and when you say that, it's like what will never die is just what is. So even when, let's say, there's no life on Earth, this consciousness is still existent, so nothing
Mm.
died.
Mm.
But you're also not saying that there is consciousness that survives death, like an afterlife, because sometimes I think I can I can hold on to the belief that when I die, this individual consciousness will get to see the answers to all my questions, and that I will feel oneness. But I guess there's no
Not the
feeling of
personal,
oneness.
not the
Already is.
personal one, not the personal one, but the absolute one knows everything now. Who you truly are knows everything now. It has no questions. is absolutely content in itself.
Yeah. I mean, the personal consciousness just wants to know what dinosaurs looked like. So I guess,
But your
uh,
absolute consciousness is that.
yeah.
It's everything, it's every possibility, it's everything that's ever happened and ever will be.
Well, Lisa, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Beautiful speaking with you.
Likewise. I hope you have a
Yeah.
good rest of your day.
Yeah. Thank you, and yourself. Bye.
Bye.